Some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. But what if crossing them was the only way to finally feel alive? If this story made your heart race or question the rules we live by, leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to follow for more stories that push boundaries. We didn't talk on the way back, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said, just not out loud. Emily sat with her hand resting between us on the console, fingers barely brushing mine. I didn't pull away. I didn't flinch. And that terrified me more than anything. When we arrived at Claire's, it was past midnight. The house was dark, quiet. Emily looked at me before opening the door. "You coming in?" she asked. I hesitated. "Don't worry," she added with a half smile. "No ambush kiss, no hidden cameras." I laughed under my breath. Tension cracked, just a little. We crept in, careful not to wake Claire. Emily led the way up the stairs, and when she reached the landing, she paused. I stopped 2 steps behind her. She didn't turn around when she said, "You can come to my room, just to talk." But we both knew we weren't going there to talk. She walked away. I stood frozen, heart pounding, every voice in my head demanding that I turn and leave. That I get in the car, that I forget everything that happened at the Overlook and pretend I was still someone who respected boundaries. But I didn't. I followed her. Her room was dimly lit by the street lamp outside her window. Posters on the walls, books everywhere. It still looked like the room of a girl, but she was not a girl anymore. She sat on the edge of her bed and watched me, waiting, inviting. I closed the door, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was doing something terrible. I felt seen. Emily didn't rush me, she didn't move until I did. I crossed the room and sat beside her, and for a long time we just looked at each other. I reached for her hand, she gave it to me. "Does this feel wrong to you?" she asked, barely a whisper. "No," I said, "but it scares me." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Then maybe it's real." When I kissed her this time, it wasn't urgent. It wasn't reckless. It was slow, certain, and heartbreakingly tender. She leaned into it like she'd been waiting for me to stop running. And I had. That night didn't spiral into chaos or passion like some forbidden cliché. We lay on her bed, fully clothed, tangled in limbs and silence. She fell asleep on my chest, her breath warm against my collarbone, and I lay there for hours, memorizing the rise and fall of her breathing, wondering what price I'd pay for loving someone I was never meant to touch. In the morning, she left before me. Claire and I had coffee in the kitchen like nothing was wrong. She asked if I was seeing anyone, and I said no. She joked I was too picky. I laughed and said maybe I just hadn't found the right person, but I had. And she was upstairs brushing her hair in front of a mirror, pretending like I was just another visitor in her mother's life. That day, when I drove away, I didn't feel guilty. I felt terrified, but not of what we were, of what we might become. Because this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a phase. This was the most dangerous truth I'd ever stepped into, and I wanted more of it. I lasted exactly 10 days. 10 days of nightly messages, aching silences, and dangerously vivid dreams I tried to bury before the sun came up. 10 days of pretending I could hold the line while knowing damn well the line had already blurred. On the 11th day, Claire called. "Emily's in town for the weekend," she said. She wanted to visit some friends, but her train got delayed. "Think you could pick her up? You're closer to the station than I am." My heart skipped. Of course. I could have said no. I could have told Claire to call someone else. But instead, I said yes. And part of me hated how quickly I had. Emily was already waiting when I pulled up. She wore a leather jacket, black jeans, and that smirk I'd come to know too well. She got in, shut the door, and didn't say a word for the first 5 minutes. The air was electric, charged. Then she said softly, "Did you miss me?" I glanced at her. Her lips were parted, but she wasn't teasing this time. Her voice was softer than usual, vulnerable, almost. More than I should have, I admitted. Silence and again. "I wasn't sure if you'd show," she said finally. "You knew I would." She turned her head slowly to look at me, and I felt the weight of that stare settle into my spine. "Yeah," she whispered. "I knew." We didn't go to Claire's. That was her suggestion. "There's a place I want to show you," she said, directing me to an overlook just outside town. A spot with a panoramic view of the valley, usually empty after dark. We got out, and the silence between us thickened. The stars above blinked indifferently, the city lights twinkling far below. I leaned against the car. She walked slowly toward me. "You keep trying to be the good one," she said, standing just inches away now. "But I've seen the way you look at me. Emily, you don't have to say it. I already know." And then she kissed me, soft, deliberate, no hesitation. My first instinct was to pull away. Every rule in my head screamed at me, but the second her hand slid against my neck, everything inside me crumbled. I kissed her back, harder than I meant to, more desperate than I'd ever admit. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulled her closer, let myself drown in the heat of something I'd been denying for far too long. When we finally broke apart, breathless and shaking, she looked up at me with something between triumph and tenderness. "You still want to pretend this didn't happen?" she asked, brushing her thumb across my cheek. I swallowed hard. No. It was the most honest thing I'd ever said to her. We stayed there for a while, not speaking, just holding on, afraid to move too fast, afraid to let go. I knew we were crossing into dangerous territory, not just with Claire, but with our own identities, our definitions of right and wrong. But in that moment, wrapped in moonlight and mistakes, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way she fit against me, like she had always belonged there. I told myself I'd leave that morning. I even packed my bag before breakfast, zipped it up, and placed it neatly by the door, like that simple act might give me back the control I was clearly losing. Claire offered me another night, but I declined politely, making up some excuse about an early meeting. But Emily, she didn't ask why I was leaving. She just watched me closely. As Claire took a call in the kitchen, Emily walked over and stood beside me at the front door. Her voice was low, so only I could hear. "You always run when it gets complicated." I turned to face her. "This isn't complicated, Emily. It's dangerous." "For who?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You or me?" Her words weren't immature. They weren't naive. They were measured, intentional. Like she knew exactly what she was doing, and worse, knew how much it rattled me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. So I left. The drive back home was silent except for the war inside my head. One part of me screaming that I'd done the right thing by walking away. Another whispering that I was a coward, not for leaving, but for denying how alive I'd felt in her presence. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in the dark. I should have been decompressing. I should have been proud for showing restraint. But I kept replaying her words, her tone, the brush of her hand. And then, around midnight, I got the message, just one, from Emily. "You didn't even say goodbye." No emojis, no punctuation, just that flat, loaded sentence. I shouldn't have replied. I really shouldn't have. But I did. I didn't trust myself to. The typing dots appeared instantly. She was waiting. That's the first honest thing you've said. My hands trembled over the keyboard. I typed and deleted half a dozen responses before finally writing, "You deserve honesty, but that doesn't mean this can happen." This time she took longer, much longer, and then, "What if I don't care what should happen?" I stared at the screen, the words blurred, my thoughts tangled. I knew where this was heading, and I knew I should stop it, but I couldn't. So I said, "Then we're both in trouble." That was all it took. From that night forward, the messages never stopped. Every evening, like clockwork, she reached out. Sometimes with a song, sometimes a photo, sometimes just a sentence that only made sense if you knew the secret beneath it. And I responded. Every time. It became a ritual, a slow burn connection that crossed lines without ever needing to touch skin. She was playful, bold, unfiltered, and I was unraveling. One night she sent a photo, not revealing, but intimate. Her bare shoulder, wet hair, a caption that read, "Do you ever miss the moment before you say yes?" I didn't sleep at all that night because I knew what she was doing. She wasn't just testing me, she was pulling me in with patience, with intention. And part of me, the part I was no longer proud of, wanted to be caught. I didn't sleep much that night. Claire had gone to bed early, as she always did after a long day at the hospital. I stayed in the guest room, lying on top of the covers, staring at the ceiling fan spinning above me like it might sweep away my thoughts. But nothing could erase the image of Emily, the shape of her smile, the way her eyes had dared me to acknowledge something neither of us should have even been thinking. I told myself it was stress. Maybe I was lonely. Maybe I was projecting desire into a void I hadn't filled in years. But then I heard a knock on the door. Soft. 2 taps. I froze. "Yeah?" I called out, throat dry. It was Emily. She stepped in wearing a long t-shirt, just a t-shirt, and socks. Her hair was pulled up messily, and she looked half sleepy, half something else. I didn't like the way my heart reacted. "Can't sleep," she said simply. I sat up, instantly on edge. "Emily." "Relax," she smiled, walking in like this was normal. "I'm not here to seduce you." The word seduce landed like fire in my chest. She sat at the edge of the bed, pulling her knees to her chest. "You're different," she said, eyes fixed on the carpet. "Not like Mom's other friends. They treat me like a child. You don't." "That's because I respect you," I said, trying to sound composed. And your mother, she looked at me again. And what if I wanted more than respect? Her words were a match, and I was soaked in gasoline. I stood up too fast, nearly stumbling. Emily, this isn't funny. Who's laughing? She said, voice low, but not mocking, just honest. I took a deep breath and walked to the window, needing distance. You're 20. I'm too old. I've known you since you were in braces. You're Claire's daughter. She got up slowly and came to stand behind me. I felt the heat of her presence before her fingers barely brushed my arm. A whisper of a touch, but it jolted through me. I'm not asking you to do anything, she said. I just wanted you to know I see you. I turned then. I shouldn't have, but I did, and we were too close. I could smell her shampoo, see the softness of her lips, the rise and fall of her breath. I hated that part of me was aching to close that space. And I hated even more than that she knew it. I should go back to bed, she said finally, her voice like velvet against my skin. Yes, I whispered, barely audible. But neither of us moved. Then, as if to grant us both mercy, she stepped away and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. I stood there for what felt like hours. I knew something had changed. We'd said nothing concrete, shared no kiss, no confessions. But a boundary had been breached, and once that happens, you can't unfeel it. The next morning, I avoided her. Claire didn't notice. She was busy packing her lunch, sipping her coffee. Emily said good morning like nothing had happened, but there was a flicker in her eyes. A secret smirk that lived only between us. And when she walked past me, she let her fingers graze my hand. Just for a second, just long enough to let me know. She remembered everything, and she wasn't backing down. I hadn't seen Emily in over 2 years. Last time I visited her mother, my best friend, Claire, Emily had still been a teenager, awkward and bookish, all braces and oversized hoodies. I remember ruffling her hair and calling her kiddo. I didn't even glance twice. But that evening, when I rang Claire's doorbell and Emily opened it, something cracked inside me. She wasn't a girl anymore. She had grown, radiantly. Her cheekbones were sharp, her skin glowing with youth, but her eyes, they held something deeper, a confidence I didn't recognize, a quiet defiance. And her body, I forced myself to look away almost immediately. Hey, she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Mom's in the kitchen, you remember where that is, right? I nodded, heart thudding in a way I didn't like. Of course. As I stepped inside, the familiar warmth of Claire's home wrapped around me. the scent of cinnamon tea, the hum of jazz in the background, the creak in the floorboard near the staircase. Everything felt normal, except for Emily. Her presence lingered too close. Even after she left to join her mother, I felt the heat of her gaze on my back. Or maybe I imagined it. Maybe I wanted to imagine it. At dinner, we sat like we used to. Claire across from me, Emily beside her. Conversations floated around, work, politics, old jokes, and Emily mostly stayed quiet, sipping her wine slowly. She wasn't supposed to be drinking wine. Is she even legal? I whispered to Claire, nodding discreetly at Emily's glass. Claire laughed. She's 20 now, college sophomore. God, where have you been? 20. That word dropped like a stone in my stomach. Old enough to drink, old enough to make decisions, old enough to... No, stop. But Emily looked at me across the table like she knew exactly what that pause in my thoughts had meant. She tilted her head slightly, just enough to make it look innocent, but her eyes stayed locked on mine a second too long, a second too deliberate. After dinner, Claire excused herself to take a call. Emily and I ended up on the couch, flipping through an old photo album she had pulled from the bookshelf. She was sitting close, too close. You remember this? She asked, pointing to a picture of us at the lake. She must have been 12 then. I was in a swimsuit tossing her into the water. I laughed nervously. Yeah, you were tiny. I'm not tiny anymore, she said, still looking at the photo. Then she turned her face toward me. You noticed, didn't you? Silence. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but nothing came out. Because, yes, I had noticed. And the worst part, I hadn't stopped noticing since the moment she opened that door. My chest tightened, guilt, confusion, desire, all braided together into something dangerous and electric. Before Claire returned, I stood up suddenly, muttering something about needing fresh air. Outside, I sat on the porch swing and stared at the darkening sky. I tried to calm my thoughts, to convince myself this was a one-time fluke, just a fleeting moment, a trick of memory, an echo of loneliness. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. It had only just begun. I knew it was wrong. Every rule, every instinct, all of them screamed, don't. But then she smiled, and the world tilted. She wasn't a child anymore. She was bold, magnetic, and looking at me like she knew. I tried to avoid her. I tried to pretend I didn't feel it. But desire has no boundaries, and temptation, it was living under the same roof. This is the story of how one glance shattered everything I thought I was.